Hello. Inside Repository Firewall, waivers are the mechanism for releasing components from quarantine. Developers or engineers will sometimes need to request exceptions to your firewall rules, and learning how best to investigate these requests and grant waivers is the difference between a smooth onboarding and a not-so-smooth one. In this video, we'll discuss some best practices for repository firewall waivers. This video is for security professionals, IQ server administrators, and anyone who needs to develop workflows for waiver requests. The video should last about 8.5 minutes. So here's the scenario. We're a repository firewall and Nexus repo customer who just turned on Firewall's quarantine capabilities for one repository, a Maven proxy repository. Right now, 4 policies are actively quarantining components. These 3, security-malicious, integrity-rating, and security-namespace conflict, shouldn't really inconvenience our developers. But this policy, security-critical, just might. That's because this last policy might block components that have a legitimate use, but also contain a critically severe vulnerability. I've got a Slack message from a developer. Let's tab over and see what's up. Reviewing the message, we can see that a developer has requested a component, and it went right into quarantine due to that security-critical policy being on. They're asking if we can give it a waiver and release that component from quarantine. That's normal. No matter how thoughtful we are when setting policy, there will always be exceptions. Now, here's where things get tricky. Determining if a waiver is both necessary and appropriate is complex, and there's a lot to consider. However, as a best practice, treat every vulnerable component as a risk, and consider avoiding that risk preferable to accepting it, even if accepting it is sometimes unavoidable. The first thing we'll do is head back to IQ server and select Firewall from the left sidebar. Just as expected, we see the component in question, which means it's currently being quarantined. By selecting this component, we're taken to the component details page. When deciding if a waiver is appropriate, one best practice is to start our investigation at the Version Explorer and compare versions tables here on the right. The columns here represent different versions of the same component. In this row, red squares indicate a high probability of breaking changes, and in these rows, red squares indicate that the version will violate high-severity policies. But look at this version. It doesn't have any square in this row, so that should mean it's free of violations. By selecting that column, we can bring that into the Compare Versions table for more info. Yep, no violations. Better yet, it's a regular release. As a best practice, if you're trying to avoid a waiver by upgrading a component, avoid alpha or beta releases, releases before a hotfix, milestone releases, release candidates, and other non-standard releases. Okay, so if our developer can use this version of the component, they won't need a waiver because the component won't get blocked because there's no vulnerability. Let's ask if that's a possibility. Okay, our developer is telling us that in this case we have to use the exact version that was requested. A nice, clear-cut best practice for deciding if a waiver is necessary is to identify if it's a no path forward situation. If the choice here is to either give the waiver or leave the developer in limbo indefinitely, then obviously we need to consider the waiver. Let's try and determine that now. I'll ask, are there any alternatives here? That component you requested is critically vulnerable. Our developer says that this is for a hotfix for a key client, and it needs to be done ASAP. There's really no other path forward right now. Later, when our organization is more in control of its software supply chain, this would be the time to have a conversation about how we ended up in this situation. But for now, let's work on getting this developer unblocked. Okay, now that we know we really need a waiver, we'll head back to IQ server and reselect Firewall from the left sidebar, then reselect the component in question. Then select the Security tab, then select one of the security violations, then Manage Waivers, then Add Waiver. Now we're at the Add Waiver page, and it's time to think critically about what we're trying to achieve. Waivers are customizable, but that means we can customize them badly. For the Scope dropdown, we'll select just the repository in question. Remember, all we're trying to do is let one developer access a component from one repository. No one else working from any other repo should be able to access this component. For the component's radial or radio buttons, we'll scope the waiver to just this version of the component. Again, one developer is asking for one version of one component, meaning we currently don't have a reason to include any other components in this waiver. Finally, for the expiration date, well, this one is sort of a trick question. On the surface, it seems like this expiration date doesn't matter, since once it's in the repository, it can't be quarantined by Firewall again, right? But that's not exactly true. Imagine that we let the component into our repository, then purge the repository at a later date. If the component is requested again, Firewall will have another chance to quarantine it. So let's keep the expiration date short. 7 days should do. There are times when it's appropriate to use a waiver that doesn't expire, but this isn't it. As a best practice, if remediation is both possible and a priority, use a waiver with a short expiration date. Finally, let's add a comment. It's a best practice to comment your waivers as best you can, as often as you can, for the same reason that you should comment your code. Now we select Submit. But we're not quite done. If we select Back to Component Details, we see that there are actually two vulnerabilities violating the security critical policy. We made a waiver for one, but now we need to make a waiver for the other. We can just repeat the process. Now that both waivers are there, we select Re-Evaluate Component in the top right corner, then select Firewall from the left sidebar again. Before, the component was in quarantine, and now it's not. If the developer tries to build again, it'll be successful. Another best practice for waivers is to have some sort of process for notifying requesters about the outcomes of their requests. There are lots of ways we could accomplish this, but since we're just getting started with Repository Firewall, I'll just send the developer a Slack message to let them know the results. Excellent! Thanks for watching this video. In this video, we covered 7 best practices which are on your screen now. You can also review them in the transcript. For more guidance on best practices, visit my.sonatype.com and connect with us at the Sonatype community.